The open road stretched before me, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the night. The hum of my car's engine was the only sound, a steady drone that kept me company as I drove. Memphis was still hours away, but the solitude of the journey was a welcome escape from the chaos of my life. The dashboard clock blinked 11:47 p.m. as I passed a faded sign announcing the next town. Welcome to Ashford. Population 1,234. It was a place I'd never heard of, the kind of small town that barely registered on maps. The streetlights along the main road cast eerie pools of yellow light, and the storefronts stood dark and silent. A gas station appeared on the left, its neon sign flickering. My fuel gauge was low, and I decided to stop. The station was deserted, the kind of place that seemed frozen in time. I got out, the cold night air biting at my skin. As I filled up, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sound of rustling leaves made me glance toward the tree line at the edge of the station's lot. Shadows moved between the trees, too large to be animals. I shook my head, chalking it up to fatigue. Still, I hurried back into the car as soon as the tank was full. Back on the road, the unease lingered. The town's outskirts were dark, the only illumination coming from my headlights. The road narrowed, hemmed in by thick woods. The trees seemed to close in, their branches arching over the road like skeletal fingers. I turned on the radio, hoping for some music to drown out the oppressive silence. Static greeted me. I flipped through the stations, but everyone was the same. Frustrated, I turned it off and focused on the road. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart lurching into my throat. The car skidded to a stop, and for a moment, all I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears. The figure didn't move. It was tall and cloaked in shadows, its features obscured. I honked the horn, but it didn't react. Slowly, it lifted an arm, pointing toward the woods. A chill ran down my spine. I considered turning around, but the road was too narrow. Taking a deep breath, I eased the car forward, swerving around the figure. As I passed, I couldn't help but glance at it. Its face was pale, almost luminescent, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. The figure vanished as soon as I passed, dissolving into the shadows. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white. I drove faster, eager to leave Ashford and its eerie presence behind. The road twisted and turned, and soon I realized I was lost. The GPS on my phone refused to load, and the town seemed to have disappeared. The woods grew denser, the darkness pressing in. Panic began to set in. Then the car's engine sputtered. No, I muttered, but it was no use. The car rolled to a stop. I tried the ignition, but it wouldn't start. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. I stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand, and popped the hood. The engine looked fine, but I wasn't a mechanic. As I fiddled with the cables, a low, guttural growl echoed from the woods. I froze. The growl came again, closer this time. I turned, shining the flashlight toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but dense foliage. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. There was no response. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the woods. It wasn't the one I'd seen on the road. This one was hunched, its limbs unnaturally long. Its eyes glowed red, and its mouth twisted into a sinister grin. "You shouldn't be here," it hissed. I backed away, my heart pounding. "Stay back," I warned, though my voice lacked conviction. The figure laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You're in Lena's domain now," it said, its voice echoing unnaturally. The name sent a jolt of fear through me. I'd heard it before, whispered in old legends about a demon that haunted the woods near Ashford. My pulse quickened as the figure advanced. I turned and ran, the flashlight's beam bouncing wildly. The woods seemed to close in, the trees forming an impenetrable wall. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could hear the creature's footsteps behind me. Just when I thought I couldn't run any farther, I stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling church. Its doors hung ajar, and a faint light glowed from within. Desperate, I dashed inside. The church was empty, but the air was thick with an oppressive energy. I turned to barricade the door, but the creature was already there, its grin widening. "You can't escape, Lena," it said, stepping closer. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. And then I heard her voice.
It started as an ordinary Saturday afternoon. Jake and I were riding our bikes through the outskirts of town, exploring places our parents had warned us about. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. That's when we saw her, an old woman standing at the edge of the road, waving us down. She looked frail, her hunched figure barely supported by a crooked cane. Her gray hair was wild, and her sunken eyes held a strange intensity. "Boys," she called, her voice trembling but firm. "I need help. My dog, he's hurt inside the house. Could you lend an old woman a hand?" Jake and I exchanged glances. It felt off, but neither of us wanted to admit we were scared. "Sure, ma'am," Jake said, always the braver of the two of us. We propped our bikes against a fence and followed her down a dirt path toward a dilapidated house. The house was worse than it had looked from the road. The paint peeled in jagged strips, and the windows were clouded with grime. As we stepped onto the porch, the wood creaked ominously. The old woman pushed the door open, revealing a dark, musty interior. "Come in," she urged. The smell hit us first, a sickly sweet stench that made my stomach churn. The inside of the house was cluttered with strange trinkets. Animal bones, faded photographs, and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. "He's in the basement," she said, pointing to a door at the end of the hall. Jake hesitated, but the woman's pleading eyes pushed us forward. I opened the door to reveal a steep staircase descending into darkness. A faint whimpering sound floated up, like a dog in pain. "See," she said, "he needs help. Hurry now." We crept down the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was dimly lit by a single bulb that flickered weakly. In the corner, a small dog lay on its side, whining softly. Relief washed over me. At least the dog was real. "Hey, buddy," Jake said, kneeling next to the dog. But as he reached out, the dog's whining stopped. Its eyes snapped open, glowing an unnatural yellow. It bared its teeth, letting out a guttural growl that didn't sound like it belonged to any animal I'd ever heard. Before we could react, the basement door slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. I scrambled for my phone, its flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. The old woman's voice drifted down the stairs, soft and sing-song. "Thank you for coming, boys. You've saved me the trouble of finding new guests." Jake grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here," he hissed. We bolted up the stairs, but the door wouldn't budge. The air grew heavier and the walls seemed to close in. "What does she want from us?" I whispered, panic tightening my throat. A scratching sound came from the walls, like nails on wood. Then the whispers began. They were faint at first, but soon they grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, but their tone was unmistakably sinister. Jake pounded on the door, shouting for help. I turned back toward the basement, my flashlight catching movement in the shadows. The dog was gone, but something else was there. A figure, its limbs too long and its face twisted into a grotesque smile, stared back at me. I screamed, and Jake spun around. The figure disappeared into the darkness, but the oppressive feeling remained. "We need to find another way out," Jake said, his voice shaking. We searched the basement, our flashlights darting over the cluttered space. In the far corner, we found a door hidden behind a stack of old crates. It was small and rusted, but it offered a sliver of hope. We pried it open, revealing a narrow tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly into the earth. "Do we have a choice?" Jake asked. I shook my head, and we crawled into the tunnel. The air was damp and suffocating, and the walls felt like they were closing in. Behind us, the whispers grew louder, accompanied by the sound of shuffling footsteps. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, but eventually, we emerged into a cavernous room. The walls were lined with shelves holding more jars, their contents glowing faintly. In the center of the room stood an altar, and on it lay a book bound in what looked like human skin. Jake approached the book, drawn to it despite my warnings. As he opened it, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The room's temperature plummeted, and the air felt thick with malice. This isn't right," Jake muttered. The old woman's voice echoed through the cavern. "You found it," she said, her tone filled with twisted delight. She stepped out of the shadows, her frail appearance replaced by something monstrous. Her eyes burned with a fiery light, and her twisted grin revealed sharp, yellowed teeth. "You were chosen," she said, advancing toward us. Jake clutched the book, his hands trembling. "Chosen for what?" he demanded. Her laugh reverberated through the cavern. "To continue the cycle, to feed the darkness." As she reached for us, the jars on the shelves shattered, releasing swirling shadows that filled the room. Jake threw the book at her, and the shadows recoiled, their screams piercing the air. Seizing the moment, we ran, our path lit by the faint glow of the broken jars. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, but eventually, we burst into the open air. Behind us, the house collapsed in on itself, leaving nothing but an eerie silence. But I knew the darkness wasn't gone. It had simply found new prey.
The drive to Jackson, Mississippi, was long but familiar. My sister, Clara, and I hadn't been home in months, and Mom's phone calls had been sounding off lately. She'd always been eccentric, but there was a strange edge to her voice now, like something wasn't quite right. When we pulled into the driveway of our childhood home, the house looked the same. The peeling white paint and the creaky front porch were comforting in their familiarity. But as we stepped out of the car, an eerie silence blanketed the neighborhood. Even the birds seemed to have vanished. "Do you feel that?" Clara asked, rubbing her arms. The air was heavy, like the calm before a storm. I nodded, unease settling in my stomach. We grabbed our bags and headed up the porch steps. The front door creaked open before we even touched it. "Mom?" I called, stepping inside. The house was dark, the curtains drawn tight. A faint smell of mildew mixed with something metallic filled the air. Clara flicked on the light switch, but the bulb only flickered weakly before going out. "That's not creepy at all," she muttered. We found Mom in the living room, sitting in her favorite armchair. Her head tilted slightly, and her hands were clasped in her lap. She didn't move as we approached. "Mom?" "It's us," I said softly. Her head turned slowly, and when she looked at us, her eyes weren't her own. Her pupils were blown wide, almost swallowing the color of her irises. A chilling smile spread across her lips. "My girls," she said, her voice layered with a deeper, unnatural tone. Clara grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What's wrong with her?" she whispered. Mom stood, her movements jerky, like a marionette pulled by unseen strings. "It's been so long since you've come home," she said, stepping toward us. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. Clara's grip on my arm tightened as Mom stopped inches away. "Mom, are you okay?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Mom's smile widened unnaturally, stretching her face. "I've missed you both," she said, but the words felt hollow. That's when I noticed the shadows in the room weren't behaving like they should. They twisted and stretched toward her. "We need to go," I whispered to Clara, pulling her toward the door. But as we turned, it slammed shut on its own. The sound echoed through the house. "Stay," Mom said, her voice reverberating with a sinister edge. The shadows crept closer, pooling at her feet. Clara and I backed away, our hearts pounding. "Mom, we want to help you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Her head tilted again, her expression unreadable. "Help," she said, almost mockingly. "You can't help me. She's here now." "Who's here?" Clara demanded. Mom didn't answer. Instead, she began to hum a haunting tune we'd never heard before. The shadows rose from the floor, forming dark, writhing shapes that seemed almost alive. Clara grabbed my hand. "What do we do?" she whispered. "We have to break whatever's controlling her," I said, though I had no idea how. The shadows lunged toward us, forcing us to duck and dodge. We stumbled into the kitchen, slamming the door behind us. "There has to be something in here we can use," I said. Clara rifled through the drawers while I searched the cabinets. We found a box of matches, a Bible, and a small vial of holy water our grandmother had given Mom years ago. "This has to mean something," Clara said, holding up the vial. The door rattled violently, and Mom's voice called from the other side. "You can't hide from me," she said, her tone dripping with malice. The shadows began to seep under the door, curling like smoke. "Whatever we're doing, we need to do it now," Clara urged. I held the Bible and the holy water while Clara struck a match. The flame flickered weakly, but it was enough to give us a glimmer of hope. We recited the Lord's Prayer, our voices shaky but growing stronger with each word. The shadows recoiled slightly, but they didn't retreat. The kitchen door burst open, and Mom stepped inside, her movements more erratic than before. "You think that will stop me?" she snarled, her voice echoing unnaturally. Clara threw the holy water at her, and for a moment, the shadows around her flickered like a dying flame. Mom screamed, a guttural sound that made my blood run cold. The shadows writhed violently, and the room seemed to shake. "Keep going," I shouted to Clara. We continued reciting prayers, and I opened the Bible to read passages aloud. The words seemed to cut through the darkness. The shadows began to dissolve, and Mom dropped to her knees, clutching her head. "It's working," Clara said. But before we could celebrate, a deep, guttural voice filled the room. "You cannot banish me. She is mine." The air grew heavy again, and the shadows coalesced into a monstrous form. The creature towered over us, its glowing red eyes fixed on Clara and me. "Leave her alone," I shouted, holding the Bible in front of me like a shield. The creature lunged, but as it touched the Bible, it recoiled with a deafening screech. Using the last of the holy water, Clara splashed it onto the creature. It screamed again, its form dissolving into black mist. Mom collapsed to the floor, her eyes returning to normal. We rushed to her side, tears streaming down our faces. "It's over," I whispered, though deep down, I wasn't sure the darkness was truly gone.